Hey guys, so this is AP World's History, Chapter 30, the Americas in the Age of Independence. So today we're really going to look at the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and pretty much how they were both kind of influenced by each other. And not only that, but we're going to really focus on the idea of migration this week. So kind of pay attention to that because migration will be a prime example in the United States of how the push and pull factors that we're going to see will not only influence the shaping of America, but will be a prime example of how the other countries also kind of played a role with their own migration patterns as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to first look at the building of American states, primarily with the United States and westward expansion and Civil War. Before we get started, let's look at the questions that you guys got to answer. 1, how did Napoleon help the U.S. idea of manifest destiny? 2, how did the Mexican-American War affect those living in the area? And 3, what was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? Okay, so the westward expansion really starts with Napoleon. Napoleon, he is fighting his own war in Europe, and he's trying to gain more land and, pretty much take over all of Europe. So he needs more money to do that. What he does is he offers to sell his Louisiana territory to the United States. The U.S. will accept the sale of it, and they will purchase the Louisiana territory, which will lead to this idea of westward expansion. So by the 1840s, people will begin to move west for cheap land, and they're going to claim that it is manifest destiny. The U.S. will say that it is our God-given right to move into this land, despite the fact that there were already Native Americans living on the land. And so they would use this idea for these annexation purposes. And like I said, it's going to present that conflict with the indigenous people who are already there. You had Native Americans who have lived there, since the beginning. And this was going to lead into a lot of conflict between the two. The U.S. forces supported the settlement and pushed indigenous off the land. So we see that the government itself is getting involved and saying, you know what, as Native Americans, you need to pretty much move yourselves from the land. They did this through something called the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which pretty much said that all natives must move west of the Mississippi to what they called Indian Territory. So this was going to lead to something called the Trail of Tears. And what the Trail of Tears was pretty much a massive migration of these Native Americans outside of their land and into these kind of reservations per se. So despite resistance, natives are going to lose the battle of, this idea of manifest destiny and westward expansion just because of the lack of technology. They just do not have the military capacity to fight against such a large government that has very exclusive military technology in this area. Another way we see that the United States expands westward is through the Mexican-American War. So westward expansion created tension between the U.S. and Mexico. At this point, Mexico owns the territories of Texas, California, and New Mexico. So what happens here is that during this time, while Texas is under Mexican rule, Texas will want to claim independence from it. And and they'll claim themselves as their own state. The U.S. will recognize this. However, while the Mexicans are fighting against the Texans to kind of bring them back in, the U.S. will bring in Texas into the United States. This is obviously going to upset the Mexicans, and this will lead into the Mexican-American War. So again, the US will win out just because of the better weaponry, the better soldiers, the better technology that they have. And Mexico will have to give up those territories of Texas, California, and New Mexico. They'll lose them and they will become American territories. So with that comes the idea of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So essentially what this treaty said was that it took possession of half of Mexico's territory, and this meant that people who were living in these areas had two options. Either they move into Mexico, further down into Mexico, or they become immigrants in a land that they've already lived in, but they are just, newly taken over because of this loss in the war. So you see either migrations back into Mexico or you see new immigrants per se that are in America. But Mexican families were stuck on the annex side at times, and they did get citizenship though. even though they were stuck there. The other issue we see come about with slavery, slavery will become an issue in these annexed territories, and this is going to lead to obviously the Civil War. So let's go ahead and look at these questions. What was the Missouri Compromise? Besides slavery, what other issue arose due to the Civil War? And how did industry and railroad help win the Civil War against the South? So first we look at sectional conflict. Again, as we have this westward expansion, tensions on the issue of slavery and new territories are going to arise. You had something called the Missouri Compromise, which was there to essentially balance slave and free states. They didn't want there to be more slave states than there were free states. With the election of Lincoln, who was an anti-slavery, this sparked the Civil War. Lincoln was running on a platform where, one, he was anti-slavery, but he also believed that it was almost like the states' rights. So he didn't want to interfere in the issue, essentially. So he had reservations about the war. His election platform, again, was this idea of non-interference, and he really questioned the constitutionality of federal action, like how much power does the government really have on this issue. And he also worried about this idea of assimilation if African Americans did get their freedom. So the issues of the Civil War were this: states' rights versus federal rights. Do the states have the right to make the decision of slavery, of them having slavery within their state, or does this fall on a federal right, especially since the acquisition of the new territories occurred? Also, there was this idea of capitalism, industrial capitalism versus export plantation economy. Industrial capitalism is in the north with the railroads, with the steel, with the larger industries that we see, whereas in the South, there are export plantation economies that exist. So this will lead us into the Civil War. 11 states will secede from 11 states will secede from the Union due to slavery, but more important, again, that issue of states' rights. The South feels it is our right as a state to decide that we want slavery. Southern economics was a major reason for secession. A lot of the Southerners felt, you know what, we're going to be fine because a lot of the world depends on our exportation of our goods. So we're going to be okay if we secede. Northerners, however, when they saw what the South did in seceding, they had a big problem with this. One, they saw it as unconstitutional. One of those, like, who do you think you are to leave the Union? And the other thing was they saw, that slavery was unconstitutional. So one of the big advantages that the North had was this promotion of industry. They had a lot of the railroads when they were fighting the war. They used them to get weapons, ammunition, supplies to the soldiers. So that was a real positive for them during the war, and it really helped to solidify victory for the war. Lincoln, eventually will create the 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery. He felt it had to go one of two ways: either we're all a slave state or we're not a slave state at all, or we're not a slave country at all. And he was already anti-slavery, so it made sense for him to pass the 13th Amendment. The North will win the Civil War again due to the industry and railroads that help them, and this will keep the U.S. united. Yes, given that there will be a Reconstruction period where it will be very difficult to bring the United States back together into one country, but it will be accomplished. Okay, so moving on to Canada, the Canadian Dominion independence without war. So, of course, Canada, wonderful, peaceful Canada, they will claim independence without a war. So, how is it done? So, Canada and Britain agree on autonomy, and no war was needed. Essentially, it was a nice, simple separation to an extent. The only issue that we had once they agreed to be separated was that there were two different ethnicities in Canada. You had British Canadians and you had French Canadians, and they were both there beforehand because of the fur trapping that they did. Um, at one point, Canada was under French rule, but they lost that power when Britain defeated the French in the 7 Years' War. So, which meant that now we have two different types of people in Canada: the French Canadians, who were the majority in Canada until about the late 18th century, until about the late 1700s. So, the War of 1812, this will really bring the British and French Canadians together. Because what happens here is that the US will attempt to claim Canadian land. And so what pretty much happens is that the French and the British Canadians are like, you know what? Let's put our differences aside and fight against the US trying to get some of our land. And they do. They are successful in repelling the US forces, and this helped to create a sense of Canadian nationalism, meaning, they were able to come together as one country, not a British Canadian and a French Canadian, but just as Canadians to defeat the United States. So, this really helps to unite them and create that sense of nationalism. And the British did not want another war. They didn't want to fight again, and what ends up happening is they will allow Canada to self govern, pretty much saying, you know what, you're on your own, you take care of yourselves. And we have something called the Durham Report, which advocated self government for Canada and became the model for other British colonies to develop self government. And we'll see this later on when we look at decolonization. So, in terms of dominion, you had the worry about American westward expansion that led to Canada's independence. Okay, so again, this is going to bring that nationalism together. And then we also see the British North American Act of 1867, which led to the Dominion of Canada and pretty much united all provinces under one Canadian rule. John MacDonald was the first prime minister, and he did the following to really show, we're all one Canada. He created a transcontinental railroad that stretched from the east to the west of Canada. All right, so questions 7 and 8. How did the War of 1812 unite different ethnicities? And 8, how did Canadian independence differ from America's independence? Okay, so now we're going to go down south to Latin America and the fragmentation and political experimentation. Your questions 9, why was Latin America unsuccessful in maintaining a stable government after its independence? And 10, why were caudillos a positive and negative factor in Mexico? So first we're going to look at the Creole elites and political instability. So similar to the United States, the Latin Americans wanted to emulate the U.S. Constitution, and Latin America had created their own constitutions. So, again, looking back at, look at this is how America did it. This is how they got their independence. They did a constitution. The Latin American states want to do the same thing, but they are going to come into difficulty. And the reason for this is because they never had true self-government. Remember, these are territories that at one point were under Spanish and Portuguese rule, and the Spanish and Portuguese were ruling under their crown, meaning that whatever was happening in these colonies, it still had to go through Spain and Portugal kind of acceptance. So it wasn't like they were necessarily ruling on their own. And so they didn't have a lot of experience on that self-government. So what happens is they're going to move from constitution to constitution due to a lack of experience. And the Creole elites are preventing mass participation in public affairs. So remember, the Creoles are the ones who are American born, but their parents are from Spain or Portugal. And they're at the very top. And one of, again, the reasons that it's going to lead to that political instability is that the Creoles are not letting people have that full participation in their self-government. Whereas we see it in the United States, it was much different. In addition, there's going to be the conflicts with indigenous people. So similar to American views, Latin Americans also pushed indigenous people aside for the purpose of agriculture and ranching as well. And so that means that, they have to find another place to live. Then we see this idea of the caudillos. So the caudillos were essentially these military leaders turned kind of like political leaders as well. So the division and discord led to caudillos, the regional military leaders, to come into power in parts of Latin America. So like I said, they're these military leaders that turn into political leaders. One of the main ones was Juan Manuel de Rosas. He was a caudillo who attempted to unite divisions, centralize government, harshly quelled rebellions, and caudillos often restored order, used terror, and identified with people. So essentially, they're really good at keeping order, but they're not really good at administering a government. Okay, so moving on to Mexico. and the fragmentation and political experimentation there. The questions here: what did La Reforma party want to do? 12, what was the main reason for the revolution? And 13, what did the Constitution of 1917 accomplish? So, with Mexico, many forms of government will succeed each other in Mexico. It'll go from a monarchy to republic to caudillo rule. And this will occur all the way up until the 1900s, which really explains why there's such division even today in Mexico and why it's not a politically sound government. So, Mexican-American War allowed Caudillo General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna to continue his rule after that Mexican American War. Later, we'll also see President Benito Juarez. Juarez will be part of La Reforma Party, and he will want to limit the power of military and the Catholic Church, and he'll really try to improve the people's lives there in Mexico. He'll have the Constitution of 1857, which moved priests from their prerogatives, meaning their what they wanted and what was going to benefit the church. He granted male suffrage so all men could vote, and he wanted to dismantle the corporate properties that were being taken because he wanted to have more property for the peasants. So, the Mexican Revolution. So, liberals and conservatives in Mexico were deeply divided. Again, remember, we have these Creoles who are kind of wanting to keep power all at the very top. And then we have these liberals who are wanting to make things fairer and spread the wealth essentially and kind of find a balance. So this was going to force Juarez government out of Mexico. And what they did was they began to suspend the loan payments to French, British, and Spanish, leading to European intervention, pretty much like the Europeans are not getting their money. And this was going to make the Europeans get involved. So Juarez will attempt to restore order, but political division still existed. And by the 20th century, the Mexican Revolution, which was from 1910 to 1920, was this revolution of the middle class and peasants wanting to overthrow their dictator, Porfirio Diaz. So, again, we see very much a lot of political instability all through pretty much the mid 1800s, coming into the early 1900s for Mexico. And the first major revolt was due to unequal land distribution. And so those with no land engaged in guerrilla warfare, and they followed the revolutionaries of Emiliano Zapata and Francisco Pancho Villa, and they fought for what they called tierra y libertad. So this was the reason that they were fighting, these revolutionaries, for land and liberty. And despite their popularity, they weren't successful against government run militaries, and it didn't help them. But they did help to develop this Constitution of 1917, which tried to address some of the problems that, the revolutionaries were fighting for, which was land redistribution, suffrage, we see education, state education, minimum wages being established, working hours established, and foreign ownership on Mexican land was trying to kind of get rid of that and make it all more Mexican owned. So we see here that Mexico had a really tough time um, trying to politically stabilize itself. And it will continue to have a difficult time, as we'll see later on. And we'll also see that there's going to be a lot of influence in there. So moving on to American economic development, the migration to the Americas. Question 14, how did migrants help American industry flourish? So after the mid-19th century, so we're looking at the 1850s here, many migrants will come to the United States and begin to work in industries. They're attractive to industry owners due to unskilled labor. So industries or the factory owners are like, yes, I want you in here because one, I can teach you not that I can teach you a skill, but you don't have to be skilled to work here. Also, labor costs went down. They didn't have to pay them as much, and it helped industrial society's profitability. I don't have to pay you as much, which means that there's going to be more profit to be made on what I sell. So a lot of the migrants are coming from South and Eastern Europe, and Asian migrants will also come into the western part of Europe. As for plantation migrants, these will usually be those from Latin America, and mainly they'll work in agriculture, and then some Asians will also work in plantation fields. So if you just kind of think about where things are on a map, Obviously, the East is where the industrialization started for the United States, so it makes sense since Europe is geographically closer to that area that the Europeans would go into that area and work in the industry. For Latin America, closer to the south, it makes sense that they're going to come into the agricultural south and work there. And then looking at the western part, we see from the Pacific, the Asian migrants coming in from that area. So just if you kind of think about it geographically, kind of makes sense where they landed. Okay, so questions 15, why were railroads important? 16, how did railroads affect space and time? And 17, how did railroads change America? So the economic expansion in the U.S. starts with the British capital. The British were investing and helped establish an industrial U.S. society. Pretty much, they had to move their prosperity to the United States, and this obviously was going to benefit the United States. And they usually invested in white-colored states and colonies, probably because similar to themselves. So, one of the more important economic developments was the railroad, and it connected the entire United States. This was the first time that the United States was truly connected through this form of transportation. Um, and it provided a lot of, means of transportation in terms of being able to send products from one place to another, being able to send people from one place to another. It was able to haul grain, beef, and hog from plain states, cotton and tobacco from the southern states, and lumber from northwest, from northwest, iron and steel from the east. So again, really bringing the goods and the people all connected, these railroads. So railroads would also influence other industries because you got to think about it. What are the materials that you're using to not only make the railroad, but to make, the trains. So you're using steel, you're using lumber, you're using coal, anything that you can think of you're using glass as well. You're using all different kinds of materials just to make the railroads and the trains as well. So that means that there's going to be all other industries are going to profit from this as well. Not to mention you're providing jobs for people. So the railroads changed the organization of space and time, which led to large scale clearing of land. Because if we're going to make this a transcontinental railroad, then we need to clear the land for that. And so this was going to extend farming and mining. There was going to be a lot of human suffering for this railroad. A lot of people were going to die because a lot of the times these railroads were being made on a time restriction. So it's going to really affect the way that people worked and affect their health. You're also going to see environmental damage because of the railroads. Again, nobody's really realizing that, the smoke coming out of these trains is not necessarily the healthiest thing or best for the environment. So we're going to see that environmental damage. And not only that, of course, the deforestation as well. But this would also create time zones in America for the railroads. In terms of economic growth, kind of like I said, it came rapidly. Everybody's really benefiting from the resources being used. Consumer demands were high because of goods that were being brought in that were not normally brought in. Labor unions are going to emerge as conflict between business owners and workers grew because it was almost like you're taking advantage of the worker. So they needed to kind of fix that. And then big business often prevailed in the 19th century. So unions didn't necessarily work out the best, and big business was also really the big thing. Okay, moving on to Canada with their policies and their prosperity. Question 18, how did Canada gain its prosperity? So we see the national policy, which attracted migrants, protect industry through tariffs, through taxing, and the national transportation systems that begin to exist, especially they had their railroads. Prairie lands were going to open to commerce so they could take advantage of the resources that were there. And of course, this was going to create conflicts with the indigenous who were already there. And due to all these policies, Canada experienced a large economic boom as well. Not only that, we see U.S. investment at this time. So even though they were wary of the U.S. involvement, they allowed them to invest economically because they saw the benefit, the money side of it. And they said, you know what, yeah, you tried to take our land at one point, but we're pretty much going to take your money, and it's going to be a win-win for both of us. So the economies became very interdependent by the 20th century. As with Latin America, your question is 1920. Why did Latin America not really have industrial economic development, and how did Latin American elites hold back industrialization? So, nothing really appealing to foreign investors in Latin America. There weren't any real resources that they wanted to gain from them. We did see some British investors invest where they could, but nothing significant in the way that we see with the United States. Rich Latin Americans were happy with economic policies as they were because, of course, they're getting all the money at the top since they were the ones reaping the rewards. Um, we do see attempts of industrialization within Mexico, especially, but it didn't have much success. Porfirio Diaz, for example, he created railroads, telegraph lines, and produced minerals in Mexico. But again, we're seeing very little profit. That's not going to allow for that industrialization to occur on the scale that it did in the US. And again, the reason for this is that the wealthy just really wanted to keep the money at the top, and they really weren't thinking that, you know, it could create better profitability for everybody if they had spread that wealth down to the bottom. So elites were the ones that profited from the foreign investments. Okay, so now we're going to move on to American cultural and social diversity. So this is really the social aspect of things and how they affected the US, the Canadians, and the Mexicans. So, in terms of societies in the US, your question 21, overall, who were the real winners of United States society and who faced struggles? So, we start with the natives. So, we already know that they were pushed out of their lands and onto reservations. The US is going to pretty much attempt to destroy their native traditions. It was either, you know, we get rid of you or you become like us. So we saw the Dawes Severalty Act, and it shifted from reservation lands to individual land tracts. And what it did was it enrolled Native children into white controlled boarding schools. And here we see this attempt at assimilation, trying to get these Native Americans to be white per se. And a lot of times the natives resisted this assimilation by either fleeing their boarding school or not agreeing to the land grant at all. So we'd rather not get any of your money or any of the land you're going to give us and just, figure it out on our own. Another group that we see were the freed slaves. So post Civil War didn't mean anything in terms of equality for the Black community. Yes, you're free, doesn't mean you're equal. Reconstruction led to some rights for Blacks in the South. By the turn of the century, Blacks faced a lot of violence, intimidation, segregation, educational and political, economic hardship. So it was still very much a struggle. And, they were still fighting for their rights, even though they had this freedom. They didn't, again, have their rights. In regards to women, we see women fight for their rights as well. Even before, in like the early 1800s, mid 1800s, they're fighting for their rights, fighting for better educational opportunities and even better employment opportunities. Migrants brought their culture into the U.S. in forms of food, music, dances, holidays, sports, and language. And some nativists did not like foreigners. So the nativists are those who feel they were native to the U.S., that they had been there for so long that they claimed it kind of, like we are really the true ones who have been here. And anybody who's coming after us are nativists. So nativism would lead to an exclusion of new migrants to the U.S. So who were the real winners here? Because I know that's the question. The real winners here was the white American man. That's who the real winner was here, because he was really the one benefiting from the natives, benefiting from the slaves, benefiting from the women, benefiting from the migrants. Okay, so usually the white American man, especially the white American factory owner, that was the real winner. Okay, looking at Canada and their cultural contrasts. So 22, what social conflicts existed in Canada, ethnic diversity. So British and French each saw themselves as the founders of Canada, which was fine, but again, they got that sense of nationalism when they defeated the US and held them back. Blacks in Canada were free but not equal, so similar to the United States. Migrants in Canada had separate, smaller communities like Chinatown, again, similar to the US. And some French Canadian fur traders intermarried with natives, creating the Métis society. So this brings us to the Métis and Louis Riel. So conflict between natives and Métis versus the British Canadian arose as British Canada attempted to invade their land. So as Britain is gathering, or the British Canadians or Canadians are getting more land, they come in conflict with the indigenous who want to retain their land. Louis Riel was the leader of the Métis and the natives, and he pretty much established like a fake country per se or territory. They assumed presidency and provisional government. Obviously, the Canadian government's not going to take this. They say he's an outlaw and they exile him. And so he'll be working in and out of Canada for several years. Um, he worked on the Canadian Pacific Railroad. There's a renewed threat from the Canadians versus the Indigenous. The Indigenous ask him to come back to help support them against the Canadians, and the Canadians saw those who were opposed to a nation dominated by British Canadian elites as a threat. So very unsuccessful opposition. All right, so next moving on to Latin America. So 23, how did ethnicity, identity, and gender in Latin America affect its development? So large-scale migrations brought cultural diversity to Latin America. Latin American intellectuals saw themselves as heirs of Europe or products of American environment. We see Domingo Faustino Sarmiento. He despised caudillos and called for a best society based on European values, really trying to bring in those Enlightenment ideas. We also see the development of gauchos, which were cowboys, and the urban residents, not ranchers, should make society's traditions. And most gauchos were mestizos for the most part, and they were very much associated or linked to the cowboys and vaqueros in the Americas. They differed from natives and agricultural and urban elites. So they were kind of like their own people, their own identity in Latin America. And it led to independent self-sufficient lives. That was kind of their claim to things, and that's kind of why they were seen as similar to like the cowboy and the vaquero. In Latin America, we see this idea of male domination, and it's really the central characteristic of Latin American society. Rural areas, men often treated women roughly, assaulted the gauchos. We see this idea of machismo being present in Latin America, which honored male strength, courage, aggressiveness, assertiveness, and cunningness. And then lastly, we see female activism, women central to the home. That was their place. That's where they, ruled or whatever. And we saw at times, though, revolutionaries like the soldaderas who played an active role for radical change. All right, so that is chapter 30. Like I said, we're going to pay very close attention to the migrations, especially in the United States, and just kind of think about how these migration patterns are also reflected both in Canada and in Mexico. All right, see you guys later.